The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across Vera Castellanos' face as she stood in the sterile hallway of St. Mary's Medical Center. Her family's laughter echoed behind her, cutting through the antiseptic silence like broken glass. She pressed her back against the cold wall, closing her eyes as their cruel words replayed in her mind. Look at her, still playing dress-up soldier. Her sister Carmen had sneered just moments before. 45 years old and still pretending she's some kind of hero. Her brother Miguel had joined in with that familiar smirk. Dad's dying and she shows up in those ridiculous combat boots like she's reporting for duty. What a joke! Even their mother, Elena, had shaken her head in disappointment. Mija, why can't you just be normal for once? Your father doesn't need your military fantasies right now. He needs his real family. Vera's hands trembled as she straightened her shoulders, the same way she had learned to do in places where trembling meant death, the same way she had done when rockets screamed overhead in the mountains of Afghanistan, the same way she had done when she held dying soldiers in her arms, whispering promises that help was coming. But here, in this sterile corridor where her father lay dying, there was no help coming. There was only the crushing weight of being invisible, of being misunderstood, of being dismissed by the very people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had survived 3 deployments, earned commendations that most soldiers could only dream of, and commanded respect from some of the most decorated officers in the military. Yet to her own family, she was nothing more than an embarrassment, a middle-aged woman playing soldier. Dr. Harrison emerged from her father's room, his expression grave. Behind him, she could see the outline of machines keeping Roberto Castellanos alive, the steady beep of monitors marking time like a countdown she wasn't ready to face. The surgeon's eyes swept the hallway, taking in the scattered family members who had fallen silent at his appearance. "I need to speak with the family about Mr. Castellanos' condition," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of years spent delivering news that changed lives forever. Carmen stepped forward immediately, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor. "We're his immediate family. I'm his eldest daughter." Miguel nodded, straightening his expensive suit jacket. "And I'm his son. We'll handle any decisions that need to be made." Their mother clutched her rosary, her weathered fingers working the beads with desperate intensity. "Doctor, please tell us he'll be okay. Roberto is strong. He's always been strong." Dr. Harrison's gaze lingered on Vera for a moment longer than the others, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "The surgery was extensive. We've managed to stabilize him, but the next 48 hours will be critical. He's been asking for someone specifically, and I think it's important that person be here when he wakes up." "Of course," Carmen said quickly. "We'll all stay, whatever Papa needs." "He's been asking for the general," Dr. Harrison continued, his voice dropping to a more respectful tone. "He keeps saying, 'Where's my general? I need to see the general.'" The family exchanged confused glances. Miguel frowned, running through his perfectly styled hair. "General? What general? We don't know any generals, doctor. Maybe the medication is making him confused." Carmen nodded in agreement. "Papa worked in construction his whole life. He wouldn't know any military people." Their mother looked equally puzzled. "Doctor, maybe you misunderstood. Roberto's never talked about any generals." Dr. Harrison's expression grew more serious as he looked directly at Vera, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. "Are you sure about that? Because he's been very specific. He keeps asking for General Castellanos. He said, and I quote, 'Tell the general I'm ready for my final mission briefing.'" The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Vera felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she experienced when enemy contact was imminent. She could feel her family's eyes on her now, confusion replacing their earlier dismissiveness. Carmen's perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat. "What did you just say?" Dr. Harrison looked between the family members, clearly sensing the shift in atmosphere. "General Castellanos. That's who your father has been asking for since he came out of anesthesia. He said, and I quote, Tell the general I'm ready for my final mission briefing. Miguel's face had gone pale beneath his expensive tan. That's impossible. There's no general in our family. Vera remained perfectly still, her training taking over as it always did in moments of crisis. She had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful response was silence, that sometimes letting others reveal their ignorance was more effective than any defense she could offer. Dr. Harrison turned to her with growing respect evident in his posture. "Ma'am, I think there might be something your family doesn't know about you." The silence stretched between them like a gulf that had been 20 years in the making. Vera thought about all the times she had tried to share her experiences with them, all the conversations that had been cut short, all the accomplishments that had been dismissed or ignored. She remembered coming home after her first deployment, Bronze Star pinned to her uniform, only to have Carmen tell her that she looked tired and she'd consider getting a real job. She remembered Miguel asking if she was ever going to settle down and give them nieces and nephews, as if her service to country was somehow a selfish choice that inconvenienced the family's expectations. Most painfully, she remembered her father's silence through it all. Roberto Castellanos had never asked about my deployments, never inquired about my rank or my responsibilities. He had treated her military career like an extended vacation, something she would eventually grow out of and abandon for a more traditional life. But now, as death hovered nearby, he was asking for the general. And despite everything, despite years of feeling invisible and misunderstood, Vera felt her heart crack open just a little bit more. Dr. Harrison was still waiting for an explanation, his eyes moving between Vera and her suddenly speechless family members. In the distance, she could hear the familiar sounds of a hospital at night, the soft footsteps of nurses making their rounds, the distant conversations of other families grappling with their own crises. Carmen found her voice first, though it came out strained and uncertain. "Vera, what is he talking about?" For the first time since arriving at the hospital, Vera allowed herself to meet her sister's eyes directly. There was something different there now. Something that hadn't been present during all those years of mockery and dismissal. It looked almost like fear, though Vera couldn't be sure if it was fear of the unknown or fear of having been so completely wrong about someone they thought they knew. The machines in her father's room continued their steady rhythm, marking time in a space between worlds, between the person Roberto Castellanos had been and whatever came next. And somewhere in that liminal space, Vera realized that this moment had been building for decades, that all the silence and misunderstanding had been leading to this sterile hallway where truth could no longer be avoided. She straightened her shoulders one more time, feeling the weight of every decision that had brought her to this moment, the weight of choosing service over comfort, duty over acceptance, truth over the easier path of pretending to be someone she wasn't. Dr. Harrison glanced at his watch, then back at the bewildered faces surrounding him. "I think perhaps we should step into the family consultation room. There seems to be some confusion that needs clearing up before Mr. Castellanos wakes fully." Vera watched her family file into the small, sterile room like defendants entering a courtroom. The irony wasn't lost on her that after years of being excluded from important family discussions, she was now apparently central to one of the most critical conversations they would ever have. Carmen perched on the edge of a beige chair, her perfectly pressed blouse beginning to show wrinkles from the stress. Miguel stood by the window, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something closer to bewilderment. Their mother, Elena, clutched her purse as if it contained answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. "Doctor," Carmen began, her voice tight with controlled panic, "I think there's been some mistake. Our sister works at the DMV. She's never been in the military, not really. I mean, she plays around with those army surplus clothes, but that's just her way of getting attention." Miguel nodded emphatically. "She's always been dramatic. Even as a kid, she'd make up stories about wanting to be a soldier. We thought she'd grow out of it." Vera felt the familiar ache in her chest, the same pain she'd carried for decades. She remembered being 8 years old, announcing at the dinner table that she wanted to join the army someday, only to have Miguel roll his eyes and Carmen laugh. Their father had simply reached for more rice, changing the subject to Miguel's Little League game. Dr. Harrison studied Vera's face carefully. "Ma'am, would you mind if I asked what your current rank is?" The question hung in the air like incense in a cathedral. heavy with unspoken implications. Vera met the surgeon's eyes, seeing something there she rarely encountered in civilian settings: recognition, respect, the acknowledgement of someone who understood the weight of command. "Brigadier General," she said quietly, her voice carrying the same calm authority she'd used when addressing Joint Chiefs of Staff. "United States Army." The silence that followed was deafening. Carmen's designer handbag slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud. Miguel's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. Elena's rosary beads scattered across the linoleum as her hands went slack. Dr. Harrison straightened instinctively, his posture shifting to something approaching attention. "General, I apologize. I should have recognized the bearing. Your father has been quite proud, speaking about your daughter who commands thousands of soldiers." "That's impossible," Carmen whispered, her voice barely audible. "She lives in that tiny apartment downtown. She drives a 10-year-old Honda. She works at the DMV processing license renewals." Vera almost smiled at the accusation hidden in her sister's observation. It was true. She did live simply, drove an old car, worked a quiet civilian job. After retiring from active duty, she'd chosen anonymity over recognition, service over spotlight. She took a federal position that utilized her organizational skills without the fanfare that came with revealing her military background. "Carmen," Vera said softly, using the same tone she'd once used to calm panicked soldiers under fire, "I've never worked at the DMV. I'm a logistics coordinator for Veterans Affairs. I help process disability claims for soldiers coming home." Miguel found his voice, though it cracked with disbelief. "But you never said anything. You never told us you were a general. You let us think—" "You never asked," Vera interrupted, the words coming out sharper than she intended. "In 27 years of service, not once did any of you ask about my rank, my assignments, or what I actually did overseas." The memories flooded back like water through a broken dam. She remembered calling home after receiving her promotion to colonel, excited to share the news, only to have Carmen cut me short because she was late for a PTA meeting. She remembered Miguel hanging up on her when she tried to explain why she couldn't make his wedding, because she was commanding a forward operating base in Helmand Province, responsible for 3,000 soldiers in one of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan. She remembered the last conversation with her father before his heart attack, how he'd spent 30 minutes talking about the neighbor's new car while she sat in her Pentagon office staring at classified briefings about operations that would determine the fate of entire regions. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat gently. "General, your father has been asking specifically about your last deployment. He mentioned something about Syria and a Medal of Honor recommendation." Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Medal of Honor? Mija, what's he talking about?" Vera closed her eyes briefly, remembering the operation that had changed everything. The intelligence reports indicating a terrorist cell planning to execute captured American journalists, the 48-hour window to mount a rescue operation, the decision to accompany the special operations team despite explicit orders to remain at headquarters. She remembered the compound, the explosions, the moment when everything went wrong and she found herself making split-second decisions that saved lives while risking her own. She remembered the aftermath, the commendations, the ceremony at the White House where the president had pinned the medal to her chest while cameras flashed and generals applauded. She also remembered calling home that night, wanting to share the moment with her family, only to reach voicemail. Carmen was at book club, Miguel was at his son's soccer practice, Elena was watching her evening telenovelas and didn't want to be disturbed. "Dr. Medal's citation is classified in its details," Vera said finally, her voice steady despite the emotional undertow.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"I never told him." Dr. Harrison nodded slowly. "He's been quite lucid when speaking about your service. He mentioned that he kept every newspaper clipping, every mention of your name in military publications. He said he has a box full of articles about his daughter, the general." Carmen stared at her sister as if seeing her for the first time. "But why didn't you ever tell us? Why did you let us think you were just ordinary?" The question cut deeper than Carmen probably intended. Ordinary. as if serving your country, leading soldiers, making life and death decisions on behalf of national security was somehow ordinary. As if the years of sacrifice, the missed holidays, the relationships that couldn't survive the demands of duty were just average inconveniences. I tried, Farah said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of attempted conversations. I tried for years to share my life with you, but every time I mentioned the military, you'd change the subject. Every time I called from overseas, you were too busy to talk. When I came home on leave, you'd ask when I was going to get a real job and settle down. Miguel ran his hands through his hair, leaving it disheveled for the first time since Vera had known him. But we didn't know. We thought you were just playing soldier, doing some kind of extended military training or something. For 27 years? Vera asked quietly. You thought I was playing soldier for 27 years? The absurdity of it might have been funny if it weren't so painful. She thought about the nights she'd lain awake in forward operating bases, responsible for the safety of thousands of soldiers, while her family assumed she was playing dress-up. She thought about the strategic planning sessions with NATO commanders, the briefings with cabinet-level officials, the operations that had prevented terrorist attacks on American soil. Dr. Harrison checked his watch again. General, your father should be waking up soon. He's been asking for you specifically, and given his condition, I think it would be beneficial if you were there when he opens his eyes. Elena finally found her voice, though it trembled with emotion. Vida, Mija, why didn't you make us understand? Why didn't you force us to listen? Vera looked at her mother, seeing genuine confusion and the beginning of what might be regret. Mama, would you have believed me if I'd told you I commanded brigade-level operations? Would you have listened if I'd explained that I was responsible for military bases the size of small cities? The question hung unanswered because they all knew the truth. They wouldn't have believed her because it didn't fit the narrative they'd constructed about their family, about their roles, about who mattered and who was just marking time until real life began. A soft knock interrupted the heavy silence. A young nurse appeared in the doorway, her expression respectful but urgent. Doctor, Mr. Castellanos is asking for the general again. His vitals are stable, and I think he's strong enough for a brief visit. Dr. Harrison stood, his demeanor shifting back to professional mode. General, would you like to see your father now? Vera rose slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settling around her like a familiar uniform. After decades of being invisible to the people who should have known her best, she was finally being called by her true name, not by strangers who respected her rank, but by her dying father, who had apparently seen her clearly all along, even when she thought he hadn't been looking. Vera walked toward her father's room with the measured stride she'd perfected over decades of military service. Behind her, she could hear her family's whispered conversations, their voices carrying a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been shame. Dr. Harrison fell into step beside her, his demeanor both professional and oddly protective. General, he said quietly as they approached the door, I should probably mention that your father has been remarkably coherent when discussing your career. He seems to know details that surprised even our military liaison coordinator. Military liaison coordinator? Dr. Harrison nodded. We have a veteran affairs representative who works with military families. When your father kept mentioning his daughter, the general, we thought we should verify his mental state. The coordinator ran your name through military databases. He paused, his expression growing more respectful. General, I had no idea we were dealing with someone of your stature. The Bronze Star, Silver Star, Combat Action Badge, and the Medal of Honor recommendation. Your father knew about all of it. Vera felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she'd carried for so long it had become part of her baseline existence. Roberto Castellanos, the man who had never asked about her deployments, who had changed the subject whenever military service came up, had somehow known everything. How? She whispered. He's been keeping a scrapbook.
It's in his belongings. Every newspaper article, every military publication mention, every official photograph from ceremonies. He told our liaison that he gets military periodicals delivered to his house specifically to look for your name. The revelation hit Vera like shrapnel from an unexpected explosion. All those years of feeling invisible, of believing her father was indifferent to her achievements, and he'd been documenting her career like a devoted archivist. The man who couldn't be bothered to take her phone calls from overseas had been subscribing to military journals to read about her accomplishments. She pushed open the door to his room, and the sight of Roberto Castellanos connected to monitors and breathing apparatus made her pause. This was the man who had built their family home with his own hands, who had worked construction sites for 40 years, whose strength had seemed as permanent as the mountains outside their childhood window. Now he looked small against the white hospital linens, his weathered hands still, but somehow expectant. His eyes opened as she approached, and despite the medication, despite the trauma his body had endured, his gaze was sharp and focused. When he saw her, something changed in his expression. His breathing steadied, and the tension lines around his eyes seemed to ease. "Mi general," he whispered, his voice rough from the breathing tube, but unmistakably proud. Vera felt her carefully maintained composure crack. She'd been called general by presidents, by four-star commanders, by heads of state. But hearing it from her father's lips, spoken with such obvious reverence and love, undid something fundamental inside.
She moved closer to his bedside, her training taking over as she assessed his condition with the same attention to detail she'd once used to evaluate wounded soldiers in field hospitals. His color was better than she'd expected, his breathing more stable. "Papa," she said softly, the Spanish endearment she hadn't used in years coming naturally. "How did you know?" Roberto's eyes crinkled slightly, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth despite the oxygen mask. He raised one trembling hand and gestured weakly toward the small bedside table where a thick manila folder rested among his personal belongings. Vera reached for the folder, her hands unsteady for the first time in decades. Inside, she found exactly what Dr. Harrison had described, a meticulously organized collection of every public mention of her name, her career, her achievements, newspaper clippings from when she'd made colonel, official photographs from ceremony attendances, articles from military publications about operations she'd led, carefully cut out and preserved. But it was the handwritten notes in the margins that broke her completely. In Roberto's careful script, he'd written observations and questions. "My daughter led this operation. Vera saved these soldiers. So proud of Mija and all. Papa, why didn't you ever tell me you knew?" Roberto's eyes closed briefly, and when he opened them again, she saw something she'd never seen in her father before: regret, deep and profound. He struggled to remove his oxygen mask, and despite Vera's gentle protests, managed to speak clearly for the first time since the surgery. "Because I was scared, Mija," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of years of unspoken truth. "Scared that if I asked too many questions, if I showed how worried I was every time you deployed, you might think I didn't believe you could handle it. Scared that my fear would make you doubt yourself." The explanation was so unexpected, so contrary to every assumption Vera had made, that she found herself speechless. She'd interpreted his silence as indifference, his lack of questions as disinterest. Instead, it had been protection, misguided perhaps, but born from a father's desire not to burden his daughter with his own fears. "I read every article, watched every news report from the places you served," Roberto continued, his breathing labored but determined. "I lost sleep every night you were overseas, but I never wanted you to know because you had enough to worry about keeping your soldiers safe." Behind her, Vera could hear the soft whisper of the door opening, the careful footsteps of her family entering the room. She didn't turn around, couldn't break the connection with her father in this moment of raw honesty.
"The night you received the Medal of Honor recommendation," Roberto said, his voice growing stronger with emotion, "I called everyone I knew. I told the whole neighborhood that my daughter, Mi General, was being honored at the White House. Mrs. Ramirez from down the street, she brought me flowers to celebrate." Vera remembered that night, remembered calling home to share the news and reaching only voicemail. She'd assumed, as always, that her family was too busy with their own lives to care about her achievements. The reality that her father had been celebrating while she sat alone in her Pentagon office created a chasm of misunderstanding so profound she didn't know how to bridge it. "But Papa, when I called home, no one answered. I thought—" "I know what you thought, Mija, and that's my fault," Roberto interrupted, his eyes filling with tears. "I was at the church, lighting candles for you, thanking God that my daughter was alive to receive such an honor. I should have answered. I should have told you how proud I was, how proud I've always been." Carmen's sharp intake of breath was audible from across the room. Vera could hear her sister's whispered, "Oh my God," and Miguel's muttered prayers in Spanish. Her mother was weeping openly, the sound of her sobs mixing with the steady beep of medical monitors. Roberto's gaze shifted briefly to include his other children in his field of vision, his expression hardening slightly. "And you three?" he said, his voice carrying a note of paternal disappointment that made all of them straighten instinctively. "You have spent years dismissing your sister like she was a child playing dress-up. Do you have any idea what she's accomplished? Do you understand that she's saved more lives than any of us can count?" Miguel stepped forward, his usual confidence completely absent. "Papa, we didn't know. She never told us she was a general." "She tried," Roberto said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades observing family dynamics. "Every phone call, every visit home, every time she tried to share her life with you, one of you changed the subject or made her feel foolish for caring about her service." The accusation hung in the room like smoke, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Vera watched her siblings grapple with memories that suddenly looked very different when viewed through the lens of truth. She thought about all the conversations that had been cut short, all the time she had tried to explain her work only to be told it was too depressing or too complicated or too far removed from normal life. Elena moved closer to the bed, her rosary clutched tightly in her arthritic hands. "Roberto, why didn't you make us listen? Why didn't you tell us?" Roberto's eyes moved to his wife with infinite sadness. "Because, Elena, I hoped you would figure it out on your own. I hoped that eventually our daughter's strength and accomplishments would be so obvious that even you couldn't ignore them anymore." The silence that followed was broken only by the steady rhythm of machines and Elena's quiet sobbing. Vera felt the weight of decades lifting from her shoulders, not because her family's indifference hadn't hurt, but because she finally understood that at least one person had been paying attention all along. Roberto reached for her hand with surprising strength, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with the same protective grip she remembered from childhood. "Mi General," he said, his voice filled with pride and love and a lifetime of unspoken admiration. "I need you to know that everything you've accomplished, every life you've saved, every soldier you've led safely home, it's been the greatest honor of my life to be your father." The words hung in the room like a benediction, transforming the sterile hospital space into something sacred. Vera felt tears she had not allowed herself to shed for decades finally break free, sliding down her cheeks as she held her father's weathered hand. Roberto's grip was weak but steady, anchoring her to this moment of profound recognition. Dr. Harrison quietly excused himself, understanding intuitively that the family needed privacy for what was unfolding. As the door closed behind him, the weight of 27 years of misunderstanding seemed to settle over the room like dust after an explosion. Carmen was the first to break the silence, her voice raw with emotion. "Vera, I am so sorry. God, I am so sorry. I had no idea. When you tried to tell us about your promotions, about your deployments, I thought you were exaggerating. I thought you were trying to make your job sound more important than it was." Miguel nodded slowly, his face pale with the realization of what they had done. "Remember when you called from Afghanistan that time, trying to tell us about some operation you were planning? I told you it sounded like something from a movie, too unrealistic to be true." Vera remembered that conversation with crystalline clarity. She had been calling from Bagram Airfield, exhausted after an 18-hour planning session for a complex humanitarian mission that would deliver medical supplies to remote villages while providing security for aid workers. She wanted to share the weight of command, the responsibility of making decisions that would affect thousands of civilian lives. Instead, Miguel had laughed and asked when she was going to stop playing war games and come home to reality. "I wasn't trying to make it sound important," Vera said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears. "It was important.
Those operations, those decisions, people lived or died based on what we planned in those rooms." Elena moved to the other side of Roberto's bed, her face crumpled with grief that went far deeper than fear for her husband's health. "Mija, forgive us. We were so stupid, so blind. Your father tried to tell us, After you called from that place in Syria, he showed us articles about the fighting there. He tried to make us understand that you were in danger, that what you were doing mattered." Vera's breath caught. She remembered that deployment, one of her most challenging. She had been coordinating with Special Operations Forces to establish secure corridors for evacuating American civilians from Damascus. The mission had required split-second decision-making under enemy fire, diplomatic negotiations with hostile forces, and the kind of strategic thinking that could prevent international incidents. When she had managed to call home during a brief lull, Elena had cut the conversation short because her novella was starting. Vera had hung up the satellite phone feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life, surrounded by thousands of soldiers under her command, but invisible to the people whose approval she still craved. "I tried to explain to your mother and your siblings what you were doing," Roberto said, his voice gaining strength as the conversation progressed. "But they couldn't believe that our Vera, the little girl who used to line up her dolls like soldiers, had grown up to actually command real armies." Carmen wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her carefully applied makeup. "We thought it was a phase, even when you were overseas for years at a time. We thought you were just being stubborn, that eventually you'd come home and settle down like normal people." "Normal," Vera repeated, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. "What exactly is normal about letting terrorists execute American journalists? What's normal about abandoning allies who risk their lives to help us? What's normal about ignoring threats to national security because they're inconvenient or complicated?" The questions came out sharper than she intended, years of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. Miguel flinched as if struck, while Carmen looked down at her hands, unable to meet her sister's gaze. Roberto squeezed Vera's hand with surprising strength. "Tell them about the Medal of Honor, Mija. Tell them what you did in Syria that made the President of the United States personally write your commendation letter." Vera hesitated, not because the information was classified, that operation had been declassified years ago, but because she had spent so long protecting her family from the reality of her service. She had learned to compartmentalize to keep the weight of command separate from family dinners and holiday conversations. "There were 4 American journalists being held by a terrorist cell outside Aleppo," she began, her voice taking on the measured cadence she used for official briefings. "Intelligence indicated they were going to be executed within 48 hours, and the videos would be broadcast internationally to maximize psychological impact." Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Miguel and Carmen leaned forward unconsciously, drawn into a story they were hearing for the first time despite it happening years earlier. The official plan was to wait for more intelligence, to build a larger coalition response, Vera continued. But waiting meant those journalists would die, and their deaths would be used to recruit more terrorists, to inspire more attacks on American interests worldwide. She paused, remembering the weight of that decision, the knowledge that acting without explicit authorization could end her career, while not acting would certainly end 4 innocent lives. "I made the call to join the special operations team conducting the rescue.
I wasn't supposed to be on the ground, but someone with my clearance level needed to be there to coordinate with intelligence assets and make real-time strategic decisions. Carmen was staring at her sister as if seeing her for the first time. You went into a combat zone to save people you didn't even know? I went into a combat zone because that's what the mission required, Vera corrected gently. The journalists were Americans, but more importantly, they were innocent people whose deaths would have served no purpose except to spread fear and hatred. Roberto nodded slowly, his eyes bright with pride despite his exhaustion. Tell them about the explosion, Mija. Vera felt her chest tighten at the memory. The compound where the journalists were being held had been booby-trapped, a fact their intelligence had not revealed. When the rescue team breached the building, secondary explosives had detonated, collapsing part of the structure and trapping 2 special operations soldiers under debris. The building was unstable and there were reports of enemy reinforcements approaching our position. Vera said quietly, "The tactical commander recommended we abort, extract the journalists we'd already secured, and leave the trapped soldiers for a follow-up mission." Miguel's face went pale. "You didn't leave them." "I couldn't leave them," Vera replied simply. "Those soldiers had followed my orders into that building. They were trapped because of decisions I had made. I wasn't going to let them die so we could avoid risk." She remembered crawling into the unstable structure while explosions echoed in the distance, using her own body to shield the wounded soldiers as they worked to free them from the collapsed concrete. She remembered the moment when enemy fire started impacting the building, sending fragments of masonry raining down as she and the rescue team carried the wounded men to safety. The Medal of Honor citation mentions that you remained in an active combat zone under direct enemy fire to personally ensure the extraction of wounded personnel, Roberto said, reading from a document he had somehow procured and memorized. "It says your actions saved the lives of 4 journalists and 2 special operations soldiers, and that your leadership prevented a significant propaganda victory for terrorist organizations." Elena was weeping openly now, her rosary forgotten in her lap. "Mija, you could have been killed. You risked your life for strangers." "I risked my life for Americans," Vera corrected, "and for the principle that we don't abandon our people, no matter how difficult the circumstances." The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitors and Elena's quiet sobs. Carmen and Miguel exchanged glances, both of them grappling with the realization that they had spent years dismissing someone whose daily decisions affected global security and international relations. "How many operations like that were there?" Carmen asked finally, her voice small. Vera considered the question carefully. "Over my career? Dozens of combat operations, hundreds of strategic decisions that affected the safety of American personnel and interests worldwide, thousands of smaller decisions that kept soldiers alive and missions successful." Miguel ran his hair through his head, leaving it completely disheveled. "And we thought you processed driver's licenses for a living. The absurdity of it might have been funny if it weren't so representative of the chasm that had existed between Vera's reality and her family's perception of her life. She had commanded brigade-level operations involving thousands of soldiers, coordinated with heads of state, made decisions that influenced foreign policy, and her siblings had assumed she was a low-level government employee marking time until retirement. Roberto's breathing had grown more labored during the conversation, but his eyes remained sharp and focused on his daughter. "Mi general," he said softly, "I need you to promise me something." Vera leaned closer, her hand tightening around his. "Anything, Papa." "Promise me you won't let their ignorance make you forget who you are," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of observation. "Promise me you won't become smaller to make them more comfortable. You saved lives, Mija. You served with honor. That matters more than anything in this room." The promise hung in the air between them, weighted with decades of misunderstanding and the profound love of a father who had seen his daughter's true worth even when she couldn't see it herself. Vera nodded, her throat too tight for words, and Roberto's eyes slowly closed as the medication and exhaustion pulled him back toward sleep. Dr. Harrison returned quietly, checking the monitors with professional efficiency while the family remained clustered around the bed in stunned silence. The revelation of Vera's true identity had shifted something fundamental in the room's atmosphere, as if the very air had been recalibrated to accommodate a reality none of them had previously understood.
His vitals are stable, Dr. Harrison murmured to Vera, his tone respectful in a way it hadn't been hours earlier. The surgery was successful, and his response to seeing you has actually improved his reading significantly. Sometimes the emotional component of healing is just as important as the medical intervention. Carmen stood awkwardly near the window, her perfectly styled appearance disheveled by tears and shock. She kept glancing at Vera as if trying to reconcile this new information with 27 years of assumptions. Miguel paced quietly in the small space, running his hands through his hair repeatedly, a nervous habit Vera remembered from their childhood when he was processing information too large for his understanding. Elena had pulled a chair close to Roberto's bedside and sat holding his free hand, her weathered fingers tracing patterns on his skin while she whispered prayers in Spanish. But even her prayers seemed different now, carrying a weight of gratitude and regret that hadn't been there before. "Doctor," Vera said quietly, "what's his prognosis, realistically?" Dr. Harrison glanced around the room, taking in the family dynamics that had so dramatically shifted in the past few hours. The surgery addressed the immediate cardiac issues, but recovery at his age will be challenging. He'll need extensive rehabilitation, careful monitoring, and a strong support system. The next few weeks will be critical. Vera nodded, already calculating logistics the way she'd done for countless military operations. Roberto would need round-the-clock care initially, then transitional support, then long-term assistance with daily activities. Her mind began organizing resources, evaluating options, preparing for contingencies. "I can arrange for the best cardiac rehabilitation facility in the region," she said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone her family had never heard before. "There's a veterans hospital about an hour north of here with specialized programs for older patients. I have contacts who can expedite the referral process." Carmen stared at her sister. "You can just make calls and arrange things like that?" "Carmen," Vera said gently, "I spent my career managing resources for operations involving thousands of people across multiple countries. Coordinating Papa's care is well within my capabilities." The simple statement highlighted yet another aspect of Vera's life that her family had never understood. While they'd struggled with navigating insurance networks and medical bureaucracies, she'd been managing supply chains that stretched across continents, coordinating with foreign governments, overseeing logistics that kept entire military campaigns operational. Miguel stopped pacing and turned to face his sister directly. "Vera, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." She met his gaze steadily, recognizing the expression from their childhood. Miguel was building up to a confession, the same way he'd done when he'd broken something valuable or made a mistake that required adult intervention. "When we were growing up," he continued, his voice strained, "you always said you wanted to be a soldier. We laughed at you. We told you it was impossible, that girls like us didn't do things like that. Did that make you doubt yourself? Did we damage your confidence?" The question was more perceptive than Vera had expected from her brother, and it touched on something she'd buried so deeply she'd almost forgotten it existed. She remembered being 12 years old, announcing at dinner that she'd been reading about West Point and wanted to apply when she was older. Miguel had laughed outright, telling her that girls from their neighborhood became teachers or nurses, not soldiers. Carmen had agreed, adding that military service was for people who couldn't succeed in civilian careers. "No," Vera said after a moment's consideration, her voice thoughtful rather than defensive. "Your doubt made me more determined. If anything, having to prove myself to you prepared me for having to prove myself to everyone else." Elena looked up from her prayers, her eyes red-rimmed but sharp. "Mija, we failed you. We should have been your biggest supporters, and instead we made you feel like you had to fight us too." "Mama," Vera said softly, "you didn't fail me. You raised me to be independent, to think for myself, to not need other people's approval to know my own worth. Those were valuable lessons, even if you didn't intend them the way I learned them." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Dr. Harrison opened it to reveal a woman in military dress blues, her uniform crisp and her bearing unmistakably military. Vera recognized her immediately as Colonel Sarah Martinez,
the Veterans Affairs liaison Dr. Harrison had mentioned. "General Castellanos," Colonel Martinez said, coming to attention with a sharp salute. "I apologize for intruding on family time, but there are some matters that require your attention." Vera returned the salute automatically, then gestured for the colonel to continue. Carmen and Miguel exchanged glances, witnessing for the first time the respect and protocol that surrounded their sister in professional settings. "Ma'am, word of your father's condition has reached some interesting circles. Secretary of Defense Morrison asked me to convey his personal regards and to inform you that military transport is available if you need to bring in specialists or transfer your father to Walter Reed Medical Center." The offer was significant. Walter Reed was reserved for high-ranking military personnel and their families, representing the highest level of military medical care available. Vera felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the emotional response she'd learned to control when faced with recognition from the military establishment. "Thank you, Colonel, but I believe Papa would prefer to remain close to home. However, I would appreciate any assistance in coordinating with the local veterans rehabilitation facility." "Of course, ma'am. I'll have those arrangements in place within 24 hours. Colonel Martinez paused, glancing around the room. "General, there's one more thing. The media has gotten wind of your father's condition and your presence here. We have security personnel available if you need assistance managing public attention." Vera sighed quietly. She'd hoped to keep this private, to navigate her father's illness and her family's revelations without the complications that came with public recognition. But privacy had been a casualty of her career long ago, and she'd learned to accept the intrusions that came with a high-profile military service. "What kind of media attention?" Carmen asked, her voice tight with concern. Colonel Martinez glanced at Vera for permission before responding. "General Castellanos is something of a public figure, ma'am. Her Medal of Honor recommendation made national news, and her work on Veterans Affairs has been featured in several major publications. When word spread that she was at a civilian hospital dealing with a family medical emergency, it attracted attention from military affairs reporters." Miguel looked stunned. "People know who you are? Like famous people know who you are?" "Miguel," Vera said patiently, "I briefed Joint Chiefs of Staff on a regular basis. I attended meetings with cabinet-level officials. I oversaw recommendations that influenced foreign policy decisions. Yes, people in certain circles know who I am." The reality was sinking in gradually, like water soaking through fabric. For 27 years, while her family had assumed she was living an unremarkable life in anonymous government service, she'd actually been operating at the highest levels of military and political leadership. Colonel Martinez cleared her throat diplomatically. "General, CBS News has requested an interview about your father's condition and your family's military service."
I told them you weren't available for comment, but they're quite persistent. "Military service?" Elena asked, confused. "Roberto never served in the military." "No, ma'am, but having a daughter of General Castellanos' stature represents a form of family service," Colonel Martinez explained. "Military families sacrifice alongside their service members, and the story of a decorated general caring for her civilian father resonates with many Americans." Carmen began to understand the implications. "You mean people are interested in our family because of Vera?" "Ma'am, your sister is one of the most decorated female officers in Army history," Colonel Martinez said simply. "Her service record includes operations that saved countless American lives and prevented international incidents. She's mentioned in military academies as an example of exceptional leadership under extreme conditions. Yes, people are interested in her family." The statement landed with the weight of absolute truth, reshaping everyone's understanding of Vera's place in the world. She wasn't just their sister who'd gotten carried away with military fantasies. She was a nationally recognized figure whose career had impacted American foreign policy and military strategy. Roberto stirred slightly, his eyes opening to find the room filled with people. His gaze immediately sought Vera's face, and when he found her, he smiled with visible relief. "Mi general," he whispered, his voice stronger than before. "Are you staying?" Vera moved closer to his bed, taking his hand in both of hers. "I'm staying as long as you need me, Papa." "Good," Roberto said, his grip surprisingly firm. "There are things I need to tell you, things I should have said years ago." Dr. Harrison stepped forward. "Mr. Castellanos, you should rest. We can have these conversations over the next few days as you recover." No, Roberto said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Doctor, with respect, I'm 78 years old and I just had major heart surgery. There might not be another opportunity to say what needs to be said. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitors. Colonel Martinez quietly excused herself, understanding that she was witnessing something deeply personal. Dr. Harrison stepped back but remained close enough to monitor Roberto's condition. Roberto's eyes found each of his children in turn, lingering longest on Vera. I need you all to understand something. When Vera left for the military, I was scared. Not because I didn't believe in her, but because I knew she was capable of things that would put her in danger. Elena squeezed her husband's hand. Roberto, we didn't understand what she was doing. I understood, Roberto said quietly. I understood because I researched everything. Every deployment, every assignment, every mission I could find information about. I knew she was serving in the most dangerous places on Earth, making decisions that affected the safety of thousands of people. Vera felt tears threatening again, overwhelmed by the realization that her father had been carrying the weight of knowledge about her service while pretending ignorance to protect himself from his own fears. I never asked about your work because I was afraid that if I showed how worried I was, you might hesitate when you needed to act decisively, Roberto continued. A soldier who's thinking about her father's fears instead of the mission might make mistakes that get people killed. The explanation was so unexpected, so contrary to Vera's assumptions about her father's indifference, that she felt the foundation of her understanding shift beneath her. She had interpreted his silence as lack of interest when it had actually been the most profound form of support he knew how to give. But Papa, she whispered, I needed to know you cared. I needed to feel connected to family, especially during the dangerous times. Roberto nodded slowly. I know that now, Mija. I understand that my silence hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. But I want you to know that every night you were deployed, I stayed awake worrying. Every news report from the places you served, I searched for any mention of casualties or incidents. I prayed every day for your safety and for the safety of the soldiers under your command. Carmen had moved closer during the conversation, her usual composure completely abandoned. Papa, we could have supported her together. We could have been proud of her instead of dismissing her. Yes, Roberto agreed, his voice heavy with regret. We could have done many things differently. That's why I'm telling you this now. Vera doesn't need our approval anymore. She's proven herself to the world. But she deserves to know that she always had it, even when we were too scared or too foolish to show it properly. Miguel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture that reminded Vera of the little boy he'd once been. Vera, I want to understand your life. I want to know about the things you've done, the places you've been, the people you've helped. Will you tell us? Will you help us learn about who you really are? The request was so humble, so different from the dismissive attitudes she'd encountered for decades, that Vera felt something fundamental shift in her relationship with her family. Not forgiveness, exactly, because forgiveness implied they had deliberately wronged her. This was more like correction, like adjusting a long-standing misunderstanding that had hurt everyone involved. I'd like that, she said simply. But Miguel, it's not just about the dramatic operations or the medals. Most of military service is about daily decisions, about taking care of the people under your command, about doing your job even when it's difficult or dangerous or thankless. Tell us about that too, Elena said, her voice filled with the kind of maternal interest that had been absent for so many years. Tell us about the ordinary parts and the extraordinary parts. Help us understand the life you've been living while we thought we knew you. Over the next several hours, as Roberto's condition stabilized and the immediate medical crisis passed, Vera found herself talking about her career in ways she had never been able to before. She described the weight of command, the responsibility of making life and death decisions, the pride of seeing young soldiers develop into leaders under her guidance. She talked about the humanitarian missions that never made headlines, the diplomatic work that prevented conflicts from escalating, the administrative decisions that improved conditions for thousands of service members. She shared stories of soldiers who had written to thank her for opportunities or support, of foreign officials who had expressed gratitude for her professionalism during difficult negotiations. Carmen listened with growing amazement, asking questions about logistics and planning that revealed an intelligent mind finally engaged with her sister's actual life, rather than assumptions about it. Miguel wanted to understand the leadership aspects, how someone commanded respect from people who might initially doubt a female officer. Elena asked about the personal costs, about relationships that hadn't survived the demands of military life, about holidays spent overseas and family milestones missed due to deployment schedules. Her questions came from maternal concern rather than criticism,
seeking to understand the sacrifices her daughter had made in service to something larger than individual comfort. As evening settled over the hospital, Roberto's color had improved noticeably, and his breathing had become steadier. Dr. Harrison expressed cautious optimism about his recovery, noting that his vital signs had stabilized in ways that suggested he was responding well to treatment. The next few days will be important, Dr. Harrison explained to the family.
He'll need to remain in intensive care while we monitor his cardiac function. But if his progress continues, we can begin discussing transfer to a rehabilitation facility. Vera nodded, already making mental notes about coordination requirements. Doctor, I'd like to arrange for some additional consultation. I have contacts at military medical facilities who specialize in cardiac recovery for older patients. With your permission, I'd like to bring in some expertise. General, that would be extremely helpful, Dr. Harrison replied. Your father is a strong man, but recovery at his age requires the best possible care. As the medical team finished their evening rounds, the family found themselves alone again in the quiet hospital room. Roberto was sleeping peacefully, his breathing steady, and his color much improved from the morning's crisis. Carmen approached Vera hesitantly, her usual confidence replaced by something more vulnerable. Vera, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you hate us? For all the years of not understanding, for dismissing your service, for making you feel invisible? Vera considered the question carefully, examining her own emotions with the same analytical approach she'd applied to strategic problems throughout her career. No, Carmen, I don't hate you. I'm sad about the lost opportunities, the conversations we could have had, the support we could have given each other. But hate? No. Why not? Miguel asked from across the room. We treated you terribly. We dismissed something that was obviously important to you. Because hate would have made me a less effective leader, Vera replied simply. When you're responsible for other people's lives, you can't afford to carry personal resentment or anger. It clouds judgment and interferes with decision-making. I learned to let go of hurt feelings because holding on to them would have compromised my ability to do my job. Elena looked up from her rosary, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Mija, you became a better person than we deserved. No, Mama, I became the person you raised me to be, even if none of us understood it at the time. You taught me to be independent, to rely on my own judgment, to not need external validation to know my worth. Those lessons served me well in military leadership. The conversation continued through the evening, with decades of misunderstanding slowly giving way to genuine curiosity and respect. Carmen began to grasp the scope of her sister's responsibilities, asking intelligent questions about international relations and military strategy. Miguel wanted to understand the human side of command, how someone balanced the needs of individual soldiers with mission requirements. Elena's questions revealed a mother's heart that had always been present, but had never known how to connect with a daughter whose life seemed so foreign to her own experience. She asked about loneliness, about fear, about the moments of doubt that must have accompanied such enormous responsibilities. As midnight approached, Dr. Harrison suggested that family members take shifts, staying overnight, noting that Roberto's condition was stable enough that everyone didn't need to remain in the hospital simultaneously. I'll stay, Vera said automatically, her tone carrying the authority of command. The rest of you should go home, get some rest, and return in the morning. Carmen shook her head. No, we'll all stay. We have 27 years of family time to make up for. Carmen, that's not necessary. Vera, Elena interrupted gently, let us stay. Let us be here for both of you. We owe you that much. Looking around the room at her family, really seeing them for perhaps the first time in decades, Vera realized that the crisis had accomplished something that years of conversation might not have achieved. It had stripped away the assumptions and misunderstandings that had kept them apart, creating space for authentic connection based on truth rather than comfortable illusions. Roberto stirred slightly, his eyes opening to find his family arranged around his bed like a protective circle. His gaze found Vera first, and he smiled with visible contentment. Mija Naran, are they treating you with the respect you deserve? Vera glanced around the room at her siblings and mother, seeing genuine remorse, newfound respect, and the beginning of understanding in their faces. Yes, Papa, they're learning. Roberto nodded slowly, his eyes closing again as sleep claimed him. But his hand remained firmly clasped in Vera's, anchoring both of them to this moment of recognition and reconciliation. As dawn broke over the hospital, filtering pale light through the institutional windows, Vera realized that something profound had shifted in her life, not just in her relationship with her family, but in her understanding of her own story. She had spent decades feeling invisible to the people who mattered most to her, not realizing that she had been visible all along to the one person whose opinion had shaped her more than anyone else's. Roberto's recovery would be long and challenging, but it would happen in the context of a family that finally understood what they had always possessed, but never recognized. A daughter whose service and sacrifice had made the world safer, whose leadership had saved lives, whose quiet strength had been forged in the crucible of combat and command. Dr. Harrison's morning rounds brought encouraging news. Roberto's vital signs continued to improve, and his cardiac function showed signs of stabilization that suggested a positive prognosis for recovery. The family listened to the medical update with the kind of unified attention they had never before brought to anything concerning Vera's life. "We'll begin discussing transfer options later today," Dr. Harrison explained. "General Castellanos, those contacts you mentioned at the military medical facilities could be very helpful in planning the next phase of care." As Vera began making calls to arrange the best possible continuing care for her father, she was struck by how naturally her family now deferred to her expertise and connections. Not because they were intimidated by her rank, but because they finally understood that she possessed knowledge and resources that could benefit someone they all loved. The transformation wasn't complete. Decades of misunderstanding couldn't be erased in a single crisis. But it was a beginning, a foundation upon which they could build new relationships based on truth rather than assumption, respect rather than dismissal, and understanding rather than comfortable ignorance. Roberto Castellanos would recover to enjoy several more years with his family, years enriched by the knowledge that his daughter had not only served with distinction, but had been recognized at the highest levels for her contributions to national security and international stability. He would attend ceremonies where Vera was honored, meet dignitaries who spoke of her with genuine respect, and finally understand fully the magnitude of what his little girl who lined up dolls like soldiers had accomplished. But perhaps more importantly, he would spend those years knowing that his silence had not been interpreted as indifference, that his love had been understood even when it had been expressed imperfectly, and that his daughter had become exactly the person he had always believed she could be, even when he had been too afraid to say so. The family that mocked Vera at the hospital when their father was dying learned that respect and recognition sometimes come from the most unexpected sources, and that the people we think we know best may be carrying burdens and achievements we never imagined. They learned that true strength often wears ordinary clothes and drives old cars and works quiet jobs, and that heroism doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and parades. Most importantly, they learned that love doesn't always know how to express itself, but that doesn't make it less real or powerful. Roberto Castellanos had loved his daughter enough to research her career, to worry about her safety, to keep a scrapbook of her achievements, and to trust that she was strong enough to serve without needing his fears to burden her shoulders. It had been imperfect love, expressed through silence rather than words, but it had been constant and true. And in the sterile corridors of St. Mary's Medical Center, in the presence of doctors who called her general, and family members who finally understood what that title meant, Vera Castellanos finally received the recognition she never realized she already possessed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.